Hello, you're listening to Storytelling Saga, the podcast that shares stories. I'm your host, Allie, and this week I'm discussing The Help by Kathryn Stockett. I first read this book a few years ago. This was my second time reading it now, and it's such an incredible novel. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for over 100 weeks. But what's crazy to me, something I didn't know when I first read this book, is that it was at first rejected by 60 literary agents. That blew my mind because this book is so beautifully written and has such important themes, most notably of racism. And you look at, say, for instance, Harry Potter, one of, if not the most popular book series of all time, and that was first rejected by a dozen publishers, so it just goes to show you don't get discouraged, you just keep pushing, eventually you'll find your publisher. So it's a great reminder for myself and for you too, if you ever plan on publishing a book, don't ever give up. So thank goodness this book finally found its publisher. And also it was made into a movie in 2011 starring Octavia Spencer, Viola Davis, and Emma Stone. And this book, what's great about it is that it's told in 3 different points of view. Our main characters are Abilene Clark, Minnie Jackson, and Skeeter Fallon. And it's set in the 1960s in Jackson, Mississippi. When I first read this book, I remember thinking how cool it was switching from points of view, because that's a difficult thing to do. Just capturing different voices, making them sound believable and distinguishing them from one another and making them realistic in the sense that they sound like real people. And this book does that so well. These people really do feel like real, live, genuine people who lived during this era. So this book is just absolutely wonderful, and even on the cover of the copy I have, there is a quote from a review from NPR.org that says, "This could be one of the most important pieces of fiction since To Kill a Mockingbird. If you read only one book, let this be it." And I definitely agree with that, because obviously To Kill a Mockingbird, one of the greatest novels in all of American literature. And this book too is just so well written and just really makes you feel for all of the characters, and whether that's for one character in particular, feeling anger, whether that's feeling sympathy, whether that's feeling very happy when they finally get their success, that in the book, with them writing their book, when it finally has paid off, and all of the struggles they go through because they want to make a difference. So that's so important. That's so lovely to see. And just, what an exceptional book, truly. It's great rereading a book when you don't remember every little detail of it. I remembered certain major plot points, but then forgetting certain things here and there, so it was kind of like reading it again for the first time. So that was enjoyable in and of itself. But we learn about each of our main characters, starting with Abilene Clark, and how sadly her son died tragically at the age of 24, and how she's worked for all these different white families as a maid, and just the struggle she's gone through after losing her son, how she had to pick back up and start over, really. And when we're introduced to her at the start of the novel, she's talking about the girl she cares for, May Mobley, and her mother, Elizabeth Leafold, how she's just so cold and uncaring towards her daughter. And that's just so one of those things that reading it makes me so angry, as we see this one relationship throughout the novel, how Abilene wants to instill goodness in May Mobley. And it's just so tragic that she lives in that environment during this era in the 1960s, where sadly segregation was still prevalent. And it's just so terrible, and how just all the violence that we even see throughout the novel. And it just makes you so angry when you think about even today how there's still racial profiling, all this violence. It's just so terrible. And then when we meet Minnie Jackson, Abilene's best friend, and how Minnie, talking about her past and her upbringing, when her mother said about working for white families and that you have to mind your mouth, and then when she had gotten fired from her first job when she was only 14 years old, just because for talking back to the white woman she was working for. And then when she is fired then after the worst character in the novel, Hilly Holbrook, she is terrible. Just, see, it's not even a real person, but it makes my blood boil, I swear. So there you go, the marks of amazing writing. all the emotions this book takes you through. But Hilly Holbrook, antagonist of the novel. So at the start of the novel, they're at Bridge Club, Elizabeth, Hilly Holbrook, and Skeeter Fallon, and then Hilly's mother, Mrs. Walters. So then when she sends Mrs. Walters to a home, and then Hilly spreads those rumors that Minnie is a thief. And it's just so terrible. Hilly with her racism, truly god awful. And then of course when she's talking about the sanitation initiative of having the help have their own bathrooms, and it's so disgusting. It's just so truly disgusting of her saying that these women, that they carry diseases, the maids, and it's just so sickening, that kind of just genuine ignorance and intolerance just because of the color of their skin. So that's truly horrible. So already Skeeter takes notice of that and is questioning that with Hilly's ridiculous home help sanitation initiative. But then Minnie, thankfully, she gets a new job working for Celia Foote. And Celia doesn't want her husband Johnny to know she has a maid. So that works out for Minnie, but even though then she's like worried for her life because she has to keep hiding and pretending and run away from the husband, scared of what might happen to her. So she's just living in fear, but she just has to make a living. And then we meet Skeeter Fallon. Her real name is Eugenia, but her nickname is Skeeter ever since she was first born, and her older brother called her Skeeter, as in a mosquito, because she was long and leggy like a mosquito. And we learn about Skeeter's upbringing, and we learn about her very critical mother, Charlotte Fallon, and them living on the cotton plantation. And we learn about her growing up with her maid, Constantine Bates, who she loved so much, who taught her kindness and self-respect because she always felt different, and people teasing her that she's ugly and that she was so tall. And then Constantine saying, well, are you? Like, trying to teach her that you're not that way, to help her self-esteem. So it's someone she always truly loved. And then sadly, she doesn't know what had ever happened with Constantine after she had graduated from college, and she comes back, and then the mother just casually says, oh, she doesn't work for us anymore. So she's just left wondering throughout the novel. So then when she also, as she wants to be a writer, that's her goal, to move to New York one day. But how Elaine basically, Mrs. Stein, she basically becomes this mentor for Skeeter throughout the novel. Since when she writes to her saying, I'm only writing to you because it was so ridiculous seeing someone with no experience wanting this job. And then she says, if you really are serious about it, just take any job at your local newspaper. And then she does that with the Miss Myrna articles, even though she doesn't know the first thing about house cleaning. And then she ends up getting help from Abilene with the answers. But then she also makes a point to say that write about what disturbs you, even if it doesn't disturb anyone else, especially if it doesn't do that for anyone else. So that's the whole thing. Write about what you care about, something that will make a difference, to stand out and to show your voice as a writer. And in this case, the injustices and the rampant racism. And the catalyst for her really is the whole thing with Hilly's ridiculous bathroom initiative. So then when she goes to Abilene with the idea, and then for the longest time it seems like the project is not going to happen. But then when she writes to Elaine saying that she has this idea, and then Elaine saying, well, you could write it, but we don't know if it'll sell, all of that, a book of essays about what it's like for black maids working for white families. And then obviously Abilene wanting to see change. And Minnie eventually as well, when really Minnie cares about what's going to come for her own children, her 5 children, that she doesn't want them to face what she has faced, the hardships in her life. How we see all this horrible stuff that happens, how that black man is shot and killed right in the front of his own house, the NAACP president, and then how the poor grandson, Robert, I believe, when he just is beaten to the point where he ends up blind, Lavagna's grandson. So tragic, all these truly horrible things, and just wanting something to change finally. So then when she agrees to help Skeeter with the book, and at first it just doesn't go well, she's just very nervous, barely giving answers. And then when she figures out a way, as she says, to make the teapot stop rattling when she was so nervous, her hands were shaking, pouring the tea. So then she has written her stories, Abilene, and then Skeeter types them up and edits. So that's what they do then for the longest time. And then eventually Minnie comes on board when she sees the thing about Hilly's truly despicable bathroom initiative. And then meanwhile with Minnie, all the things that are happening with Celia and how she has this big house, but she just lies around all day, and Minnie thinks she's a drunk. And then it turns out that when she's drinking these bottles, she thinks she's drinking whiskey or whatever it is. And then it turns out it's this formula supposedly to help with pregnancy, because she sadly has suffered miscarriages. And then when she suffers from another one, when she's bleeding, and that scene with them in the bathroom, and it's so tragic and truly heartbreaking, and she's crying hysterically, and Minnie can barely stomach it all, but then she calls the doctor, and she just sadly had lost another child. And then also the husband, Johnny, ends up finding out about Minnie, but then he's saying, oh, it's okay, I'm glad you're here to just kind of be there for her. And then really how Celia sees Minnie as a friend, but Minnie keeps saying, no ma'am, we're not friends, and she wants to teach her how to cook, and she's just ashamed. So then she's saying, oh well, eventually I'll tell him. Minnie is pushing her to tell her husband about her so she doesn't have to keep pretending. She wants to get involved with the league where Hilly's the president. And then with Elizabeth Leafold and May Mobley, and then when Elizabeth is pregnant again, and then when Abilene gets an idea that with Miss Leafold, with how terrible she treats her own child, just always ignoring her and just always impatient with her. So then when Abilene gets the idea, what if every day I tell her, you are kind, you are smart, you are important, that I'm making a difference for the next generation. And then how she always said that after, when the child is around 8 or so, she always would leave the family and go to a new family for her own personal reasons. That being that's when she sees, sadly, that more often than not, they're being taught that black people aren't as good as white people, and it's absolutely devastating. So then she's trying to instill this goodness in May Mobley to help prevent that, to help with the next generation. Similarly with Minnie, with her motivation to help with the book in the first place, that she doesn't want her children to have to suffer, to have to walk on eggshells, and just to be treated with respect, just to be treated with decency as any human being. And then with Skeeter, meanwhile, there's also a whole subplot with her love life when she starts dating the state senator's son, Stuart Whitworth. And first he starts out, well, first actually he's a jerk, preoccupied when Hilly had set her up on the date. He was preoccupied, and he was saying how, I wasn't ready to date because he had just been dumped by that girl, Patricia, that he was engaged to. So then when they do start dating, though, they start over. And she's so in love and things are going so well. But then when she and her parents go to dinner and meet his parents, that's when then the father is saying how, he was so hung up on the other one. And then how she really doesn't know him. And then when he's saying he needs to take a break. So then the mother is devastated because the mother, as we see, she's always so critical of Skeeter's appearance and just wanting her to settle down and get married. Meanwhile, she has no idea about the book that she's writing. And then Abilene is asking so many other maids, and they're all saying no because they're scared of what will happen if they talk about their lives and the people they have worked for. Even though Skeeter is promising that they'll change the names, they're being extremely cautious. But then what finally drives them, that changes their minds, is after Hilly's maid is sent to prison because she was short on paying for her son's college tuition. She had asked Hilly for a loan, saying she would pay her back. Hilly denies her, so then she confesses in a letter to Skeeter. She confesses, I stole from that woman. I stole this ugly ring that she never wears. Truly vile, evil woman, Hilly. The one saving grace, literally the only thing, is that she is a loving mother. But then, because she had stolen that, Ewell May, she ends up in prison. So then because of that, that's when all these maids, one by one, go up to Skeeter and say, I'll help you with the story. So then she ends up having 13 maids to write these stories about. So each one their own chapter. Some of them are nice stories about how the people they worked for have helped them in trying times. For instance, with Lavanya, when her grandson was blinded, how she was given paid leave, how Luann Templeton, the woman she works for, that she really helped her out, and really how Skeeter is seeing all these sides to people, like, oh, I never even really talked to that girl, but then I find out she's so kind towards her maid, or how sadly some of them are really more tragic stories with abuse, taking all of the good and the bad, just what it was truly like working for these families during this time. And then the whole thing with Stuart comes to an end when then they had gotten back together, Stuart and Skeeter, and then he proposes to her. She says yes, but then she's saying, there's something I have to tell you. And then she tells him as much as she can about the book that she wrote. And then he's realizing that, oh, I don't even know you. So it's good that they had given another chance, but that it wasn't really meant to be. That this was what was important to her, writing this book. This is what she truly cares about. So it's nice she had that first real romance, but it wasn't meant to last. She wasn't meant to just always be stuck in Jackson, because then she loses her friends. Since Hilly finds out when she has those laws in her satchel, so she finds out that eventually that Skeeter is writing this book. But also the whole thing with the bathroom initiative, when Skeeter writes it in the League newsletter, and then when she just changes one little thing, and then all of those toilets end up on Hilly's lawn, but then the plan backfires on her when Hilly just has her husband installing them. And then when she loses her friends, then she's like not the editor of the League newsletter anymore. Her friends don't talk to her. But on the upside, when they're able to get the book published, and she has to really, you just see that whole process as well with just trying to get a book published, or just trying to get it written, really. And then just when she submits it just in time, the deadline, when they had less time than they thought. And then she also finds out the truth, because she clues in the book, the truth about what really happened with Constantine. And we learn more about Constantine's life, how she had a white daughter because her own father was white. And then the mother had argued with her, and then it was just like a really terrible thing. And then the mother had fired Constantine. Constantine went to go live with the daughter, and then sadly, after only 3 weeks, she had passed away when she was in Chicago. And it's just really devastating. And then also, with the mother, with how critical she is, there's sympathetic moments when sadly she is suffering from cancer, but then she ends up getting better, thankfully. But then meanwhile, also with Skeeter, how she just slowly but surely has nothing. She loses her friends, she loses the League, her writing job for the League newsletter. She loses Stuart. She's so isolated and alone, and it's as if it's this price she's paying, but she just doesn't give up, persevering with the book. So then when she tells them the great news that Harper and Row wants to publish their book, and they're so excited, but then they're all worried about, oh, well, what's going to happen? Skeeter's saying, well, it may be nothing, and Abilene says, well, I'm betting on the good, that good will come of it. And then Minnie says, well, I'll stick with bad, one of us has to. And there's also the whole thing with the benefit that they do with the League every year. And that's when Celia, that's the one chapter where it's not told in anyone's point of view. It's told in third person point of view. The rest, it's always either Abilene, Minnie, or Skeeter. And then Celia just kind of makes a fool of herself because she just wants to be part of that group, wanting to help out. But then Hilly just doesn't like her at all because Celia had ended up marrying her ex-boyfriend. But then when she gets sick, because she had been drinking too much. And then there's a whole incident with Celia and Minnie when there was this naked man in the yard, and then at one point when she just protects Minnie, and Minnie says how she looks up and she sees, oh, I see how the type of woman she used to be, that white dress woman she used to be, that she was strong, and that she feels like she doesn't fit in this lifestyle of being a housewife and being with these types of women in the League. So she feels like she was always letting her husband down. That's why she needed the help. But then she just has that resurgence, that moment of strength where she goes out and chops down this mimosa tree that throughout the novel she's always kind of staring at and disgusted by, and like, oh, I want to chop that down. So it's like she's taking control finally when she chops it down, Celia. And then thankfully, after everything that happens, Celia finally comes clean to Johnny about everything, about the past miscarriages. And then how she says, her and Johnny, when they say that, no matter what happens, Minnie, you'll always have a job with us. And it's really touching. And then Minnie says how, oh, now all three of us fools are just crying in the kitchen. And it's really sweet. And then also Minnie is pregnant again. And there's a whole other thing with her home life, how her terrible husband, Leroy, is abusive to her, beating her up. And it's really, really horrible. So then when the book is published, Minnie makes sure that before they publish it that we need some kind of insurance. So she includes the whole pie story when she talks about the terrible, awful things she did, feeding Hilly that pie to get back at her. A gross pie, where if you read the book, you know. So then she did that to protect them all, because then at first Hilly reading it, when it ends up on the channel that they were watching, like the TV show with the book review, with their book that they simply call Help. So then at first when Hilly's reading it and she's saying, oh, it must be about this person, accusing all the wrong people, telling them to fire their maids. And it's so sickening how she's just like the word of God that everyone listens to. There's mostly all this bad stuff, and even though they've had this book published, and that in and of itself is a triumph, when it seemed like it wasn't even possibly going to be published. They were putting their lives on the line, revealing these stories, and then when Hilly reads it, then when she finally gets to the end and they just hear a scream, and you know it's because she read that whole thing about the pie. She doesn't want anyone to know that she's the one who ate that pie. So then she's saying, oh, it's not about Jackson. Then she goes to Skeeter saying she's going to tell her mother on her, and it's just so ridiculous. And Skeeter has a moment where she's just saying, I can't believe, like thinking to herself how it's truly baffling that we were ever friends. But then there's some good that comes of it. At Abilene's church, for instance, when they're all applauding her, saying that we'll protect you no matter what, and that they give her a copy of the book with all of these signatures in it, and that they tell her to give one to Skeeter as well. And then also how Luann says another good thing when she talks to Skeeter, saying, well, Hilly's saying you wrote that book, and whether you did or didn't, I just want you to know that I'm not going to fire my maid, even though Hilly said that, because I'm not going to vote for her anymore either. So it's one good thing that comes of it, that when she's saying how my maid, she's Luvanya, she's the reason I get out of bed sometimes. And Minnie also then, when her husband is fired because Hilly's husband said to fire him, so then when he beats her up again, he's going to throw her out of the house. The kids go to the neighbor's house, and then she calls up Abilene crying hysterically. And then when Abilene says, this is my moment to tell her, when she's at her lowest point crying in this gas station bathroom, and she tells her, Minnie, you don't have to be beaten up by Leroy anymore, you can be free, you can escape. So Minnie decides that that's it now. And she also has a moment where she thinks, yes, what will I become if he stops beating me up, if I can just break free from this abuse, because her own father was a drunk and now she had married a drunk, and it's so terrible and tragic. But that, you know, she's so resilient. And the whole thing in the first place, how she included that pie story, when Abilene realizes she did that to protect us, because then once Hilly reads that, she knows she'll be driving people away from, oh, it's not about Jackson, and stop accusing people, because she's like in a tailspin. She doesn't know what to do, and it's so sickening. But then when that whole thing with the pie, and then Abilene just says, you're a beautiful person, Minnie. And that's just so beautiful too. And then when Skeeter gets the job offer in New York, and it's what she's been aspiring for this whole time, so that's just so wonderful too. And it's like you cheer along with them in all of their victories. And when she says, well, I'm not going to go, things are so bad here in Jackson. And then when Minnie tells her, you have to go, it's going to be bad here whether you're here or not, that there's nothing here for you, you have no friends, you don't have anyone, you can't just, and then she realizes, I can't just stay here for my parents. There's also a nice moment though, she just says, I'm going to New York. And then before she leaves, when she goes to Abilene, and that they hadn't seen each other for so long because it was too risky, Abilene just gives her a nice big hug. And she's realized when she looks at her, like, I can't believe how young she is. And look at this that we've done. We've made this book together. And then when she gives her a copy of the book too, and then she gets all teary-eyed and she says, thank you. And it's just so sweet that they did this to make a difference. They did this to finally see some change, to see growth, to see people coming together. And then ending Abilene's arc when Hilly basically takes it upon herself to fire Abilene on behalf of Elizabeth. And Elizabeth has no clue that that chapter 2 is all about her. But before Abilene leaves, because then she just says goodbye to, at that point when Elizabeth had another child, she calls him Little Man. And then when poor baby girl, she calls her, when poor May Mobley is crying, telling her, don't go, Abby, don't leave me. And then when she says, you are my last baby, I'm retiring, because then before Skeeter had left, she had told her that since she was going to New York, that Abilene, she recommended her to do the Miss Myrna column for the newspaper. So then it's just an uplifting thing where she just tells her one more time, I need you to remember, and she repeats the words she always tells her, you're kind, you're smart, you're important. And throughout their relationship, Mae Mobley and Abilene, how she was telling her stories, their secret stories, just teaching her that black and white were all the same. And also when Abilene had spoken to Minnie and saying how these lines we make up, they're all in our head, that kindness has no boundaries. So it's all so beautiful. And then when she just walks out and saying, well, here I was thinking I was done with a fresh start, but maybe it's not too late for me, that she doesn't know what's going to happen next, but that it's going to be okay. And it's just so uplifting and beautiful. And also with Skeeter, when she says how before she goes to New York, she's going to stop by Chicago to visit Constantine's grave, which is so touching. And it makes me wonder, just because we don't see that happen in the novel, since it ends with Abilene leaving her last job as a maid, but now starting over, going to be writing for Miss Myrna, starting over again. But that makes you wonder, maybe Skeeter, when she went to visit Constantine, I bet she took out the book and read her the chapter she wrote about her. I could just envision that. It's so beautiful. And Kathryn Stockett, in fact, wrote this book in the first place because thinking about her own family maid growing up and just the connection she had with her. And she says, what I am sure about is this. I don't presume to think that I know what it really felt like to be a black woman in Mississippi, especially in the 1960s. I don't think it is something any white woman on the other end of a black woman's paycheck could ever truly understand. But trying to understand is vital to our humanity. In The Help, there is one line that I truly prize. Wasn't that the point of the book? For women to realize we are just two people, not that much separates us, not nearly as much as I'd thought. I'm pretty sure I can say that no one in my family ever asked Dimitri what it felt like to be black in Mississippi, working for our white family. It never occurred to us to ask. It was everyday life. It wasn't something people felt compelled to examine. I have wished for many years that I'd been old enough and thoughtful enough to ask Dimitri that question. She died when I was 16. I've spent years imagining what her answer would be, and that is why I wrote this book. So when it all comes down to it, it's all about the connections and how we're much more similar than we are different as people. We all live and breathe. We all have beating hearts. We all have struggles. That's why it's so terrible when people are discriminated against for the color of their skin. That's so truly horrible. That's so truly devastating. And that's why this book and the book that they write help. How when Minnie at one point says, this is just a book about life. Like they're just writing about their lives. That's all it is. Understanding people, making a difference, speaking from the heart, talking about living your life and what's important to you, and all of the hardships and all of the love and all of the kindness and all of the strength of humanity. And as Abilene says at the end, I laugh and cry at the same time at this, because just last night I thought I was finished with everything new. So a truly beautiful, wonderful, important, incredible novel. And with that, that is going to conclude this week's episode of Storytelling Saga. You can follow the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at Storytelling Saga, as well as on Twitter at Storytell Saga. You can also send me any questions, comments, or writing prompts by leaving me a message in the contact section of storytellingsaga.com or by sending me an email at storytellingsaga@gmail.com. Next week, the best thing you can do is find a person who loves you for exactly what you are. Good mood, bad mood, ugly, pretty, handsome, what have you. I'll be discussing Juno. Until then, thank you for listening, and remember, write what you love.